just more stuff you can do just to make it refined and better. Just to run through the process of where we should be. Once you bring your texture back, you assign your new material, you assign your standard surface. On the color channel, you go to File, we turn off any filters, we find our color, there's my color. Okay, it worked, cool. I'm going to rename this ThorHammer. On my weight, I take that up. On my metalness, I map metalness. This is a black and white image. Because it's a black and white image, I have to tell it to use the alpha channel. We're finding that Arnold is a little bit finicky. Sometimes we do have to click this button. Sometimes you don't have to click the button. So I'm going to click the button because I know in my project that's what I had to do last time. Okay. I also, just to kind of help preview this, I set up a sky dome. So under Arnold, under lights, I went to sky dome. That way when I hit the Arnold render, I can see that my stuff is still working. Okay, just a little preview area. Now I can come back here to roughness. Yes. Go to File. Go to Folder. Filter type is off again. And then because this is a black and white map, again I click on alpha as luminance. If I hit play so this thing updates, there we go. Okay, so far everything is looking good. And then the last thing that I need to do is go to geometry, go to bump mapping, go to File, change this use as to tangent, and go to File 6 and bring in my normal map. Now, when I click on this, I may get something weird. The other day I was getting something weird. But still thinking. I also want to turn my filter off. There we go. Oops. Back to my bump. Back to this. Back to off. Okay. So I am still getting that weird thing. And I'm in some aspect. I'm glad I'm getting the weird thing so I can show you how to take care of that. So the second I put my bump map on, I get this like weird splotchiness. And some of my pieces are not rendering correctly. Now, this isn't going to be the case on everyone's. I don't know why it is the case on mine. As the case is in Dennis. Just ours. So what you have to do is go to the normal map, go to color space, and change this to raw. And what that does is basically gets rid of any color correction information, and it just reinterprets how the colors are laid out in the file, getting rid of all that. So you may have to do that, you may not have to do that. I had to do it. And I know it's working because I'm getting my stuff right here. That was only in the normal map, and my stuff right there. So it's working. Awesome. All right, so now this image here, if we look at just what it is, as a standalone object, it's actually pretty boring looking. There's not much going on with it. There are things we can do or should do to make this better, especially if you guys are thinking about a year from now graduating and actually having demo reel pieces. You should start considering it, because the Thor hammer is like our first piece where you could actually use this as a demo reel piece. Okay. So what I want to do is basically create a little scene or environment, something that's going to make this look a little bit more interesting. So there's a bunch of stuff I can do creatively. You just have to kind of think about something and then try to work towards creating that. Right inside Arnold, there's a bunch of cool stuff too. Just screwing around on the software last night, I was looking at this. This is a photometric light. Okay. Now, if I turn off my outside light, so I have no intensity on it, let me pull this away. There we go. And I render this out again. So I go back to Arnold, go to render. You're going to see that there's nothing showing up. A photometric light needs what's called a light profile. So it needs actually like, what does this light look like? And that sounds kind of weird because up until this point, we basically just added lights and the software knows what to do with it. So it doesn't work until I plug in an actual file. So you get these files from, learn to spell, profile, light, there we go. They're called IES light profiles, or profiles light, because Google doesn't discriminate against how I wrote that in there. If you go to Derek Jensen's page, he has these here. And what's cool about it is if you look at these are all the different profiles of lights that will come into Arnold, and our light will actually have some definition to it, apart from being just this like boring, straight, no detail kind of light. Okay? So you get this, you put in your source images, you right click, you extract it, boom, you have all of these IES files. So now I can go here, go into any one of these IES ones, and I'll do star focus. That one might be interesting. Okay, so I click that. I'm going to refresh this in case it needs it. I'm going to start cranking my intensity up. There we go. And if I was closer, you'd actually be able to see what's happening there. There we go. So you can kind of see my Thor hammer a little bit. I'm going to go crazy, add another 0 in here, boom. Okay, so we're not really seeing a whole lot of light on here just because there's not really anything else in the scene. Okay, with our other one, it wrapped around the entire object, so we had reflection and other stuff kind of feeding into it. With this, it's basically just this one light. I could still go crazy and still keep adding more light to this. I'm surprised it hasn't blown it out yet, but there it is. But what I can also do, which is kind of awesome, is if I go to my render settings and I go to Arnold and I go to environment, under the atmosphere, I can create, I believe it's that one, AI atmosphere volume. That might be it. We'll find out in a second. I'll hit stop. I'll hit refresh. Come on. Oh, it's behind it. All right. So what this does is it creates an atmosphere that I could then add a little bit of density to. And now I can actually see my light coming from its source and shining into my scene. And now I have this like, oh, Thor hammer. Whoops. Okay, that's pretty sweet. Much more impressive looking, much more interesting looking than just the Thor hammer sitting in the middle of nowhere. I can take my density down. I can take my light intensity down too. Okay. So no matter where I look at this, you'll see that the light and the fog and everything are kind of like working together, which is, again, super awesome. You could also tint the color of the light. Whenever you do that, obviously it should be a tint and not like a full-out color like I just did. Okay, and you'll see even though like the side of that isn't lit up, because of the fog, we actually can see some of that detail. Okay, so that's one thing that you could do. And you'll see our light profile up here. If I were to just use a regular spotlight, it would look very boring. It would basically just be like this big fog, this like perfect gradient shining out. Just to show you that, if I turn off that light there, and I turn on an area light, and I start cranking up my settings, you can see this looks pretty boring, because it's basically just like a straight shot of a light. Okay, now that could look cool if we had a reason for it. If we had fluorescent light bulbs, that would be a reason to have something like that. If we had a window, that would be a reason for that. Okay, with this just kind of floating in space, there's not really like a reason for it to be like that. Let me crank this back up again to a couple 100,000, whatever. Okay, and if I change the IES profile, that'll give me a different look. So if I choose, I don't know, Bullard. Holy cow, that's bright. There we go. So now we have, again, a different kind of look to that light that we could tweak and modify and put into our scene. There's jellyfish. And you'll see based on the light profile that my intensities are obviously going to be a bit different. So there's 22 right there. And I believe I can scale. No, it's not going to let me scale. Radius? Oh, either one. I thought it let me do either one of those. It doesn't. Alright, so that's one thing that you could do to your scene. Okay. Now again, that just takes it just one step further. It's not really like refining it to where we would want that to be. So I'm going to open up this other file that I have, which is number 4. I'll just save that one. And in this one, I actually made a little ground here for it. I put the hammer on the ground, and then I moved this around a little bit, okay? In order for this to look natural, like it's actually like laying down, I needed to be able to grab the points and move them. Now, because we laid out the UVs, I can't stretch them, but some subtle movements, some rotations is fine, okay? So what I was doing is I went to Edge, and I double-clicked one of these edges, and then I hit the B key. And if you remember from your hotkey list, B key is the soft select. And if I hold down B and I middle click and drag, that's how soft it's going to be, okay? Now the reason for using soft select is if I don't use it and I try to rotate this edge, that's really good. You'll see it does that, which is obviously disgusting. If I use soft select, as I rotate it, it's going to rotate what I had selected, then everything else just kind of gets a softer rotation to it. And the same thing with my moving. As I move it, it'll line up much nicer. Okay, I can hold down B, middle click and drag, and then kind of put that in there. Cool. Alright, so that's how I did this handle area there. To do the ground, I created a plane, just a huge polygon plane. I shift, oops, not caps locked. Whoops. I shift right clicked and I went to the sculpt tool. Okay, and if you remember from the intro class, we did a character at some point. That character we sculpted. This is a very similar tool to that. B and middle mouse button is the brush size. M and middle mouse button is the amount of movement you want. Apart from that, you typically don't need to play with any of the settings. Alright, so it's a pretty big brush and it's pretty high, so as I click and drag, you can see how I'm pulling up that surface. Okay, so lots of divisions on here in order for this to even happen. Otherwise it wouldn't work. If I only had 6 divisions there, I wouldn't get much movement at all. Okay, if I need to smooth, I hold down shift and I click and drag, and that smooths out the stuff. So if you remember from ZBrush, if you use that, that was the hotkey for doing that. If I need to push a surface in, I'll hold Control and push the surface in. Too much. Shrink my brush. You can see how much fine detail I can pull up just in these smaller areas and then kind of smooth it out. Okay, so what I want to do is give this the appearance that this is bigger than just this square area. So basically what I did is built up all the sides around it so that you can't see any edges, and then put a lot of detail right in that center area where the hammer is. Okay, so when you're looking at it from here, you can't see any edges anywhere. That was the idea. That's the goal of putting it the way I put it. Okay, I'm also want to find a cool angle for this. So something like we had before where it's just straight up and down is pretty boring. This can be kind of cool like that. I want to find something dynamic because I want to add a bit of depth of field to this to make this look nice and interesting looking. Okay, so depending on what I feel is a better angle, that's what I'm going to go with. For the texture for this area, I basically found a picture of ground. I'll show you what it looked like when I first brought it in. Okay. Roughly like this. Okay, so let's pretend it's perfectly right there. Alright, so now if we look at the ground, you can see how pixelated it is and how grainy it is. That entire plane has that image stretched over the entire thing. I don't really care about stuff that I can't see on the fringes of it. I want a nice sharp texture right in the middle. So what I did is I went to my UVs. The first thing I did was grab this and just do an unfold on it. Because I modified the shape, I pushed and pulled and tweaked it, moved stuff around, I need to do an unfold just so it makes it not stretchy anywhere. Then I'm going to grab it and just scale it up to a ridiculous amount. Okay? So if my Thor hammer is within this range right there, that's going to be a pretty sharp, crystal clear texture. That's all I care about. I don't care what happens on the other side of it. The only thing I have to look out for is if I have a seam running down the middle. So as I move around here, you can see where the pattern is repeating. You can see this dark spot, and then this dark spot, and that dark spot. You can even see the line happening right there. As long as I don't see that, I don't care. Okay? I could actually go into Photoshop and paint it out too using my clone stamp. I could change the color of the rocks in Photoshop if I want to. Photoshop is still a tool even though you're not in the class. Alright, so here's the angle that I decided on, is this one here. I'm going to do my little Arnold render. There's my hammer. I want to make sure that it's still making contact with the ground so that it feels like it's actually touching the ground. So here, if you look, the base of this is not touching the ground. There's like this huge gap there. And so it looks like the handle, the strap area is really stiff, and that's what's holding it up, and that doesn't make sense. So what I need to do is switch back to my other camera, find the hammer, and just move the points up until it looks like it's actually touching it. Like that. That feels like it's touching it. I'm going to pull up this point just to have an extra one there. Yep, that looks good. Okay. I also want to be on the lookout for stuff that's poking through. So like right here, that's poking through. So I may want to use my soft select, make that bigger, and just pull that up a little bit. Okay. I can also rotate it some so that it is, like if this was a softer strap, it would probably be like sagging in on itself versus kind of staying upright. Again, it just creates some interesting look to it versus being a perfectly round loop. Okay. That's the whole idea, is to get the item across that there's something else happening, that these things are realistic, even though obviously we know they're not. Back to perspective 1. Nope. Back to perspective. There we go. Back to Arnold render. And now we should see that that actually is touching the ground. And the same thing up here. This is touching the ground. I made sure those faces were right along aligned with it. Okay. All right. So now that looks okay. I'm not really too happy about the colors in here. I think we could probably add a little bit more interesting lighting. Don't really need the background so much because it's really low res. So I'm going to go to my sky dome, and I'm going to take the camera visibility off. So that should get rid of it, but still allow me to see it in reflections. Okay. If I didn't like the image, obviously I could just go and find a new image and drop it in there too. So don't think that you always have to stick with the same image you had. I also have an area light that's kind of like shining on it from the top. Oh, don't do that. All right. You're good. Okay. So now we're going to go to the attribute editor and change the color of this light. So again, it's more of a tint versus an actual color. You see when I had it at the color, it looked like we were on a different planet. I pull that down some. Now we're getting that coloration the way we want it. I may want to tweak some of my materials. I may say, you know what, even though it looked good in substance and I brought the textures in here, I still may want to tweak some of that metalness or some of that reflection. So if I go to that metalness, and remember this is alpha is luminance, so it's bringing the alpha channel in, I can play with this to control the alpha channel. So if I pull that all the way down, you'll see how that metalness area goes away. So there's no more or very little reflection on there. As I pull it up, that will give me a little bit more of it. Okay. Now I'm also going to go to my roughness and do the same thing. I'm going to go to roughness, and I'm going to make this further down here. You can use this crop tool to actually just highlight an area you're trying to like focus on, and it'll only render that area. So that looks good. It's a little bit softer than it was a second ago. That works for me. Okay. So now what I want to do is I'm going to start planning for my render. I actually want to get a little bit more of a dynamic angle. I'm going to click on my camera, go to its attribute editor. I got to turn off this like docking thing that's on here. Change my focal length a little bit. And changing my focal length will give me the ability to create more depth in my scene. If it's too high, if this is like 110 or 100, everything's going to appear flat. Okay? That doesn't really feel like a huge scene. When I go back to 25, the scene feels huge. It feels much bigger than it is before. Alright, so that's good there. Alright, cool. Alright, let me just turn some stuff off. All right, so the depth of field. So we could add depth of field to this item. If I go to my render view, not that one. I go to my other render view. There's my Thor hammer. If I go to my Arnold section inside my camera, they have this enabled depth of field. And what that should do is basically I pick a distance from my camera that's in focus, and then everything else is out of focus. Okay, so if I turn this on, we're not going to see anything yet. I have to tell it how far I want the item to be. So I need to figure out how far from my camera this object is. So if I go to display, heads up display, object details, it'll show me distance from camera of any item I select. So when I click on this, it'll say it's 9.16 units away. So that's what I'm going to punch in. So I click my camera again. I go down here to my distance, 9.16. I go to my aperture size, and I start to increase this. The bigger the aperture, the more blur. So if I go to, let's say, 10, you'll see this entire thing is pretty much a big blur. If I go to 1 even, you'll see it's still blurry. I need to get it down to like 0.1, 0.05, something like that, in order to even see my item. Okay, so there's 0.05, maybe 0.1. All right, just like everything, just wait for it to get done. It'll say, obviously, down here, done rendering or, finished. But now we can see this area here is pretty clear. And then this area back there is getting softer, and then this area up here is getting softer. This number here that it gives you, it's obviously not picking that top left corner, because that top left corner is closer than that back right corner, okay? So it's kind of like a rough number. We may have to tweak it. The easiest way to get the exact number is if I create an object and just put it there. So if I make a locator, which is just this like nothing object, I'll move it up so you can see it. There it is. And I hold down the V key and move it. It'll let me snap to any object in my scene. There it goes. So my number that I typed in was 9 point something. That corner is actually 6.7. Okay? So that's why this is still a little bit soft. So if I go back to my camera again, and I go back to that number, 6.7, we should have a pretty clear corner right here, and then everything else should get softer as it goes out. Okay? Now what we're going to see with this whole process is that this is going to take forever to do. Okay? Every time we click that button, it has to regenerate all of this stuff. What would be cool is if we could do this in post, and that's what I want to show next, is how we can do this inside of post. It's nice. It has a purpose. If I had a more complex scene, sure, this would be easier to do here. But if I decide later I want to change any of this stuff, I can't really do that inside of post. I'd have to come back and re-render it out. All right, so I'm going to turn that off. You can see it's clear here and then fuzzy there. We get the idea. Just for fun, future reference stuff, let me stop this and close it. You can change your camera type from perspective into like a VR camera. So you could actually, inside of Maya, render out your stuff so that it could be put into a VR camera. I may actually have to render it out to see. Yep, there it is. So there's my VR camera, and it's side by side. Here is fisheye, so you can have a fisheye camera, and you can change some of the settings here. Oops, hit play button. There we go. Here is cylindrical, so it does that, and then here is spherical, so it does that. Okay. The only one that I see really of a use is maybe the VR one, or the fisheye one is kind of a cool one. I'd have to research a little bit more to see what the other ones might do. All right, so we're back to perspective. Depth of field is off. Close that. We're back to a crystal clear-ish image. I'm going to go to my render settings, and this is where we're able to set up the items that will let us adjust depth of field afterwards. Okay, so depth of field is all based on how far from my camera is an object. So I need to create what's called the depth pass that shows me how far each item or each area is. So inside of the render settings, all the way on the AOV, I believe it's arbitrary output values. That's what I think that means. I'm going to delete these just so we have new ones. Remove. Okay. So over here, the built-in ones. So this is all stuff that you could export out that you could then tweak later. Okay. So one of them is called Z, and that stands for Z depth, which means the depth of our objects in our scene. So if I render this out, I just double click it, it puts it into the active mode, and now it's rendering out that Z depth also. Okay. So I'm still at my low res, I'm still at 960 by 540. You want to work as quick as possible on these things. Don't render it out at 3000 trying to save time. It won't. Keep your render settings pretty low. This is actually probably higher than I even should have it. To see that depth of field, or that depth, I go to over here where it says beauty, and I change that to Z. That's the depth. Okay? We can't see it because there's so much information there. The only way to see it is to take the slider and drag it left. And if I drag it slow enough, we'll be able to see it. And that's what we should see, is this gradation from the closest to the furthest object in our scene. Okay? We go the other way, we don't see anything. Cool. So that's one thing that I want to bring in. I also want to bring in ambient occlusion. So we looked at that when we were in Substance, the black and white like cavity map. I want that out of here too. There is no ambient occlusion inside here. I thought there was originally, but there isn't. So I have to add my own. So I will say add. I will call this one ambient occlusion. And it creates a new one. Now that doesn't do it, it just doesn't know. If I go to this and go to ambient occlusion, you'll see it's just blank because it doesn't know what to do. So if I come over here and I go to this arrow and I select it, one of my windows, maybe I closed it. Maybe it's behind here. There it is. My attribute editor, I'm going to create it. Okay, so under default shader, I'm going to click map. And I'm going to search for amb under Arnold, and that will bring up ambient occlusion. Okay, so what it does is it assigns a shader to the objects, and on that shader, that's where we're getting our stuff. That's where we're getting our ambient occlusion. Right there. Sweet. If I need more of a, or if I need less of a spread, I can pull the spread down, and that'll get me less of a spread. If I need more fall off, I can pull the fall off up. You youngins can't appreciate this as much as I can. This was like a huge process back in the day because you literally like would render out your entire scene. Then you have to go back and retexture everything to ambient occlusion. Then you have to retexture everything to depth, and then you have to, it was a huge hassle. The fact that I can see it live as I'm like screwing with sliders is amazing. You will see that this is going to be grainy. I'm going to grab a little sample area here so it can update. This is going to be super grainy. I think I even have my render settings probably up too high here. And that's too high there. There we go. So now we're going a little bit quicker. All right, so this is going to be really grainy. That's what samples here are for. So as I crank those samples up, this should smooth it out. Okay, it's a bit smoother. I can go even further for a bit smoother. Okay, now some of that will be inside my render settings I just turned back down. Inside here, I'll up those later, but that's where I want to adjust this is right here. All right, so I can just set that aside for a second, go back to my render settings. Under the AOVs, under the arrow here, under select AOV node, I want to click on a button that says, under the Arnold driver, to merge the AOVs, okay? So by default, what would happen is if I rendered this out, I would get a separate image for each one of my passes. So I'd have a separate image for depth, a separate image for ambient occlusion, and a separate image for my color. And I don't want that. I want everything to be bundled into one image that I could then modify. Just so you can see some other ones, if I rendered out a, oh look at that, see how nice that is now? How it's nice and smooth. It's gorgeous. If I rendered out an ID pass, and I go to ID and I turn this off, this pass actually separates each item by a separate color. So if I needed to later on, I could actually use this as a color selector and modify something in post based on that color selector. So if I wanted to adjust the color of this cap, I could select that blue and say, you know, everything that's that blue, I want to make it green, whatever. Okay. In this case, that's too far ahead of what we're getting, so just put that back. For people who are in the animation class, there's something called a motion vector. Motion vector is the motion blur. So if I want to do motion blur in post, I render out the motion vector, and then I can do motion blur in post. So that stuff that takes too long to do right out of Arnold, we can do it inside of Nuke. Okay, there's no motion, so there's no motion vector. You could also do CPU time if I can find it. If I can find it. There it is. And I'll change this to CPU time. So what this is going to show is where the objects in your scene are that are taking the longest to render. Okay? So not something you would actually use in your final image, but if you're rendering your stuff out and you're like, why is this taking so long? You could render this pass and then look at the image and it'll show you where the stuff is. We'd have to take this into Nuke to actually see because it's just white with this black splotchiness, but that's what we could use that for. There's a bunch of stuff in here too that you could also play with. What was P? Position pass, that's what that one is. That's pretty cool too. I believe there's also a UV pass, or is that just that? Alright, I'm going to render out this position pass too. We'll just look at that in post. Alright, now if I look at my ambient occlusion, you'll see way back here that it's completely black. My background is not rendering, okay, because I don't have a background in my scene. And the same thing for my Z. We can't see way back there, but I want to see what values it's pulling. If we don't have the right values, what could happen is, let's pretend that it's reading that background as black. When we start doing our depth of field, it'll read it as a value of 0, meaning that it's right against the camera, meaning that it's super close, okay? So that could be an issue. So what I'm going to do is open up Nuke X. We'll get flooded out. Nuke X is the only nuke that has depth of field. So if you don't open up the correct one and you don't have depth of field, you will not have... if you don't have depth of field, you have not opened up Nuke X. Okay. I've gone through this before, but again, I want you guys to see all these options because when you do have portfolio pieces you want to create, these are the steps you have to take to finish them up, right? Anyone can get to the point of just taking the hammer perfectly straight up and down, boom, sending it out. But what else can we do with it? I'm going to read it in. So I hit R, and then I go find my stuff. D drive, yes, organize, there, ThorHammer, images, temp, 3, 4, and if you look here, you see the folders. There's one that says ambient occlusion, beauty, perspective, and then Z. That's it rendering out each into a different folder. It's not a huge deal, but when you get into stuff later on, you may have 5, 10, 20 different passes, especially if you work at a company. They have basically 6 to 7 passes per item on a car, okay? So imagine like everything that's rubber on a car, that has 6 to 7 passes. Everything that's sheet metal has 6 to 7 passes. Everything that is glass or plastic, 6 to 7 passes. So it's a lot of stuff. So what I want to do is find my work. I think that's it there. And hit open. That's not it. Oh, I never saved it. That's why. I'm going to save a multi-layer EXR. Now, it doesn't matter if this is the lower size. This is the awesome thing about Nuke, is that whatever size we do our stuff on, when we put the new one in, it just automatically updates all that stuff. Okay, if this was Photoshop and we did a bunch of work to it, we'd have to redo all that work. With Nuke, we don't have to do that. All right, so now I should have inside here my test hammer, which is 10 megabytes, which is huge for one file. I hit 1, so I can drag this over and hit 1. I can delete this one. Okay, now a couple things to look at. Red, green, and blue. That's our color channels. So we know that it has red, green, and blue, obviously, because it's that image. There's white, which is an alpha channel. So if I move my mouse up here and I hit A, I should see alpha channel transparency on there, which I do. That's important because I got rid of that background. I may want to add a new background in there, something different than what was originally in the rendering, okay? The green little box on the side, that means there's other stuff listed. Now, to get to the other stuff listed, you go up here, and then you'll see, here's the ambient occlusion, just like I typed it in inside of Arnold. There it is. Here is my position pass. Here is my depth pass. Now, that's where we came into Nuke to see, because we have to see how far away it's reading that background. So as I move my mouse over this background here, do you see the numbers 99999.99512? Okay, so it's reading that the background definitely is far away. That's what I want. I want it to seem like it's far away. If I was rendering this in RenderMan or Mental Ray, because there is no background, it automatically reads that as 0. So then I have to do other stuff to make that work. Okay? So depending on what renderer you go to, this is stuff that you always want to check or at least be aware of. All right, so, oops, I don't know what I'm doing. Go back to alpha, cool. So what I need to do now, I have all the passes that I want. I want to test out my depth of field. I want to test out my ambient occlusion and make sure that they work. If they don't work, then I can go back to Arnold, fix it up, come back to Nuke, check it out, make sure it works. I don't actually render out my high-res image until I'm satisfied with my low-res image, because I may render 10 or 20 times before I get to that point. And if you started rendering anything big, you know how long it can take. So I need to get, what I need to do is extract, I need to pull out of that my ambient occlusion, okay? So I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to hit the tab key, and I'm going to hit shuffle. And what shuffle does, it's a stupid name, and it's stupid buttons over here. It can move stuff around. That's all it does. Okay, that's what it's shuffling things around. I'm going to go to where it says RGB and just put ambient occlusion. Okay, so that's all it does. It just, for what we're using it for, it just pulls the ambient occlusion channel out of that EXR. So now if we look at this, this is everything. This is just my ambient occlusion. Okay, so imagine like in Photoshop, I have 2 different layers. That's what we're looking at, is those 2 different layers. So now I want to take my ambient occlusion and I want to merge it on top of the original image. So I'm going to click off into nowhere and hit M. And I'm going to merge my shuffle with my original. Okay. Now, if you've not used node-based stuff before, this is going to be confusing. But the only way to get used to it is by doing it over and over and over again until it's locked into your brain. In order to see the merge happening, I have to make sure that it's connected to the viewer. So when I click on the merge and hit 1, it automatically connects that merge to the viewer, so then I can see what's happening. Okay? So right now the merge is set to be over. So basically I have my color, I have my ambient occlusion, and it literally is just like stacked on top of it. I want the merge to be a multiply. So my ambient occlusion actually makes my item darker in some spots. Okay, anywhere it's dark here, whoopsie, anywhere it's dark here, it should be dark on my colored image. So I go over here to over and I change this to multiply. All right, so now let's look and see what it looked like before and what it looks like after. So if I click on the merge, I can use D as a hotkey. Now again, there's hotkey lists for Nuke on the wall, so if you do want a Nuke hotkey list, definitely do it. Or if you're taking notes, write down each hotkey list. Make a separate sheet of paper so you have these things listed. So I hit D and D, okay? So I'm going on and off with it. So you can see the difference between using that ambient occlusion and not using the ambient occlusion. If you look especially right here in this handle area, it looks a little bit soft and a little bit kind of desaturated, but once it's on there, it actually feels a little bit more like grounded, more like locked into the surface. Same thing with under here. This feels a little bit too soft, and then that kind of locks it in a little bit better, okay? Now, we're not stuck with that. Just like Photoshop, if I click this and hit 1 again, I'll see that. If I needed to adjust this, I don't like the amount of darkness that I'm getting, I can adjust the colors on it. If we're in Photoshop, what tool would you use to adjust an image's black and white values? Levels, right. So levels would be 1, curves would be 1. Hue and saturation, exposure, there's like a million of them, right? So all of those are under this tool, this tool here. And there is a histogram, there is hue corrects and shifts. Most of the time I jump to grade, okay? Because in Nuke, grade is like, it has this like everything kind of thing to it, okay? You could actually, if you have a picture of a dog and a picture of you, you can use grade to help blend the colors from each picture to lock them in better. Okay. So I'm going to take, I'm going to look back at my, well, let me show you it first, and we'll look back at the other one. Here's the black point. Okay, so it's showing you what the blacks of that image are. So as I go this way, you'll see it's graying it out. And as I go that way, it's darkening the black areas or the gray areas. Same thing with the white point. If I go this way, it's going to gray them. If I go that way, it's going to whiten them. Lift is going to just lift the entire thing. This is going to darken the entire thing. They'll look like they do something very similar, but they are doing something different. There is a purpose for each one of those sliders, okay? So what I want to do now is I'm going to go to my merge, I'm going to hit 1, and I'm just going to play with the multiply here. And as I pull this up, what it's doing is it's taking my whites and making my whites brighter. That's what it's doing, okay? And the reason that I would want that is so that I get more contrast in those areas. Now I could also use the, set that back to 1. I could also use the black point here to darken up some of these areas and the white point here to whiten up some of those areas. So I could do that too, right? Don't look at any of these as I don't know how to use it, so I'm not going to touch any sliders. Drag a slider back and forth, see what it does, okay? Some of them you'll just, it may not do anything. Like if I go to this one, oops, sorry, that one. Okay, this one does everything. This one has everything. If you want to reset it, you can click this to reset it back to the default, and then you can play with that again. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is just get some nice contrast. And again, if I want to see a before and after, I hit D, and I can see a before and after. So now look at that. That's much more impactful than what we had here. There's nothing there. And then we put this on, and now our ground by the hammer is much brighter. Our hammer is a bit sharper. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Sweet. All right, so now what we need to do is the depth of field. So I go to the merge, and I type in Z to focus. There it is. It took a second to load. Okay. So the way the Z to focus works is it needs a depth channel. So it needs to know where am I getting the depth information from. Remember we rendered out the Z pass. So any one of these Z's is the same exact thing. So I'm just going to grab Z red. Okay. Then I have this focus point I put on the object I want to be in focus, right there. And it's done. Okay? Now, inside of Maya, do you remember how long it took for me to pick the item, find out the value, type the value in, and then render it out and see what it looked like, and then I had to wait again, and then type the value, change it, move it around. With this, it literally is moving this point, and now that's in focus. And then I move this point over here, and now that's in focus. I move the point over there, and now that's in focus. Okay? So very quickly, I can move this point around to get a different focus depth of field. Now we do have some kind of like weird fringy thing happening here. The reason for that is because when we have pixels, there's pixels here and there's pixels there, and in the middle of these pixels that we can't really see too good is like a furriness, like a little gradation, and that's where we get these like weird things. The idea would be that we would put a background in here and that fuzziness wouldn't be as apparent. The fact that it's this blue on the black is really kind of like coming off. I also want to change my math here to direct. I like to have that as direct. And sometimes that'll help clean up some of the stuff there. Yep, see, it actually did clean that up better. Okay. I could also make this less blurry by pulling the size down. Or more blurry. Okay, so this is the benefit of doing this in post, is that this is 10 times quicker. Imagine if I had an animated hammer. I did a 360 with it, and then I'm like, cool, now I'm going to add depth of field. That's going to take probably twice as long at least to render out, or 3 times as long. And then I make a mistake, and oops, it's not focusing. Then I have to go back and tweak it. All of this can be animated. And what's cool about this whole setup is once I've done it on one object, and this is the amazing thing about Nuke, I replace this image, and now it follows that same chain for everything else. So if I were to load my gears in here, my gears, if they had a Z depth and they had ambient occlusion, it would pick those up because they're already there, because it's already looking for them. So if I do 20 projects in this class, every project I can just drop in here, and it automatically has the stuff connected, as long as everything is named consistently across the board. All right, so that is awesome. That looks a lot better than it did before. Cool. What else can we create? Let's do a background, okay? So I'm going to read a background image in, and for this, I don't care what it is, but I'm just going to grab that same image that I didn't want on there originally. So this will be new pack jellyfish scattered. No. Oh, there it is. Mountain to valley. All right. So there's my background. Okay. So I'm going to put this as my background for my Thor hammer. So the way that I do that is I have to be aware of what else is going on inside my scene. So if I look at this stuff here, this is stuff for the ambient occlusion. This right there gives us ambient occlusion. That's what makes that work. If I put this in here before the ambient occlusion will just make the background black. So I can't do that. So I have to do it after the ambient occlusion, and then it'll be cool. Okay. So I'm going to go to merge again. I'm going to say this is my foreground, which is A. B is my background here. I'm going to click on the merge and hit 1. There it is. There's my Thor hammer. Okay. It's super tiny because my one image is this big and my Thor hammer is that big. Okay. So I need to obviously correct that because that looks stupid. I'm going to click on this one, and I believe I have to do a pre-multiply. I don't really have to do that. I didn't do anything. I need to reformat this to the correct size. Okay. So I'm going to go to this item here. I'm going to hit tab, and I'm going to say reformat. Maybe I'll do crop. That'll be a different one. Okay, so I'm going to do crop. And what crop allows me to do is, just like you would in Photoshop, just grab a section. Okay, so I'm going to grab like this here. Like that. Okay, and I'm going to say reformat. And what that does is it takes my image that, or my area that I cropped, and it actually like shrinks it to that size. Now we'll still see an inconsistency here. Okay, we'll still see we're getting some stretching. My Thor hammer, if I look at the resolution, is 960 by 540. My new cropped image is still 2300 pixels by 1500 pixels. So now I'm going to add in a reformat after this and just change it to 960 by 540. Now when we go to bring in our higher res image, all I have to do is just change this number to 3000 by 2400. That's all I have to do there. Okay? So now when we look at this merge, our Thor hammer is sitting right there. And I think I still do have to do a pre-multiply. No, why are you looking so weird, Thor hammer? You look like that. Why are you doing that? 96540, that's right. Let me clear my nodes here for a second. That's on top, yes. My merge is an over, yes. Oh, let me check out, that's why. So when I did the, when we started off, remember I did the A for alpha channel and we had this nice clear cut alpha channel? When I did the merge here, it replaced my alpha channel with the ambient occlusion. Okay, so I'm going to go to the merge and just say don't merge the alpha. Right? So now there's no alpha coming in from this channel, but I still need to have some sort of transparency. Maybe I can go here. Let's see. Yep, there we go. Okay, so instead of doing that on the multiply, I'd left this all RGBA. I went to the shuffle and just chose white for that. So what this bottom one does is the alpha channel. So I can either clear the alpha channel or keep it the way it is. So it kept it the way it is. So now when I go back to this one and we look at it, there it is. With the background and without a background. So now I can also go into here where the crop was and where my reformat is, and I can add a transform and I can start to move this up. All right. Then I can also go through here and add in a, remember the color correction things, I can add a hue correct. This is different than Photoshop stuff. The biggest thing here is I want to take my saturation for all the channels, just pull it down some. There you go. So it fits a little bit better into that. Maybe I will take the blue. Let me go to my saturation again. There you go. So you can't see it, but there's colors that are affected here. If I go to my hue shift, no, not the hue shift. What's the other one? That one should have had it. I'm surprised it didn't. Hue correct. Yeah, there should be colors there. I'm not sure what happened there. That might just be my display. But each one of these areas is a separate color. So imagine your hue and saturation, or your hue rainbow. That's what we're adjusting. So when I'm clicking over here on this saturation, and I'm grabbing these, I'm actually taking the blues and keeping the blues about as saturated as they were, actually pushing them a little bit further. But then all the other colors in there, I'm actually desaturating them. Okay? So if I pull this all the way down, you'd see that everything is desaturated except the blues. And if I pull it back up to where it was, you'll see how it overly saturates that area. Okay, so it's kind of neat how you can do that. I'm just not sure why that's not lining up right. All right, so now we go back to our Z to focus, and what we should see is, what happened to you? Oh, whoops. This is the importance of node-based editing. So my Z to focus comes right from here before I add it in the background. So I just drag this to the background. And so now the background is included. And now the background is nice and fuzzy too because it updated all that stuff. Sweet. And my image is blurry for some reason. So let's sharpen that up. And make sure that everything else is lined up too. So when you start merging stuff together, sometimes things go away. So like my Z to focus, or my Z depth is gone. Okay, because I merged here, it still had it. There's my Z to focus, or my Z depth. When I did my second merge, my Z is gone. What? Oops, not looking at it. There we go. All right, so I have to get that Z back. And this is the confusing part about it, but it is what it is. So I can just say also merge the Z. And now, holy cow, that's crazy bright. Pull that down, pull this down. There we go. Now it works perfectly. Okay, and I could say on this one, also merge all, and it'll merge all the channels in there, which again is a nice little feature. Okay, so there's my Thor hammer. Much more interesting again than just having it vertically with just the gray background doing nothing else. Okay. And then the final thing that I could do inside here, you could do this in Photoshop too. You can kind of do a Z to focus in Photoshop, but it locks it in. It doesn't let you edit it. If you change your images, then you have to redo the whole thing. So this part here you could definitely do in Photoshop. That's not a huge issue. I'm just going to add a constant. I'm going to merge it into here and set this to multiply. And then on this constant, I'm going to hit the O key and I'm going to add a roto. I need to take my roto or my constant and resize it real quick to 960. There we go. Then go to my roto and I'm just going to draw a little circle. Okay, this is like the pen tool. Okay, so there's that. And then I'm going to take these, I'm going to click on one of the points and grab the little feathering things. That's what that is. And this is going to feather our mask out. Okay, so just so you can see what it looks like, if I click on this and hit A for alpha, that's the alpha channel that it's generating. Okay, I basically want to create a dark area around this, and I'm using the alpha channel to do that. So as I click this and drag that out, you can see the effect of it. Okay, I'm going to invert it, so I go over here and click invert. I'll do that right there. I'll go to my merge. I'll hit A to get back to this. I will click on the roto and say pre-multiply. Why aren't you working? That's working. That's not working. Let me go to my constant and give him an alpha channel. Maybe that's what he wants. There it is. So my constant needed values. It was completely black apparently. Okay. So there, it goes to the roto. It's pre-multiplied, which makes the alpha channel applied, like it actually like sets it to work. And then it's multiplied on top of there. Okay, so now I can go back to my roto and invert it. There we go. Sweet. Okay. Let's do a side by side so we can see what it looks like before and what it looks like after. Okay, so there's my before image, there's my after image. Okay, there's no contest which one is going to stand out more, which one's going to look better. And like I said, with any of this, you could actually take this and do an animation, and all of these settings will go to it. Our depth of field, our ambient occlusion, the background, the vignette, all those things will trickle right into it. You can even see here this like weird part. Look at that, nice and blurry. Okay, so start thinking about what you're going to be using your stuff for. And then I think, let's just see if this works. Points. This is just a fun one. Let's see if this works. Surface points. I'm going to go to P. Yes, it did. So this is the points pass. So this is one of the things that, there we go, that we can use it for. It actually like takes all the points that are inside of our render, and it can actually like lay out what it looks like inside the scene. Now where that could be useful is if I'm trying to recreate a background that moves perfectly with my camera. I know where my end is. So then I can put an object, an actual 3D object inside there that would line up perfectly so that as my camera moves around, my background moves in coordination with it, okay? You could also use this for other stuff, like when they made District 9, they used this kind of thing to relight and retexture stuff. So because this is now a 3D object, I don't know if this is going to work. We'll see. Let me just add this to a scene. There we go. Grab my light. And my keys got messed up again. I don't know what happened. They were all set and working. Control, there we go. Yep, no. I don't remember how to do that part. But that's what they did. We will not be doing that in this class. There's not really a need for us to do it. But I just think it's a cool thing to even show. Especially because Nuke actually does allow 3D. So I could actually export, just like I did the Thor hammer into Unreal. I could export my Thor hammer and bring it into here. Let's say we had a scene where we had a display, right? We have a watch, a device, something, and we wanted to create a screen that lined up with it. We could make the device and everything inside Maya, bring that into Nuke, and actually put the device, the screen, inside of Nuke. That way we can control it. We can export our camera from Maya so everything would line up. It's like amazing stuff we can do. Okay, but again, I just think it's awesome. Cool. And then to get this out of Nuke, we just write it. So every time we bring something into Nuke, we read it. When we take it out, we write it. There it is. And then I just specify where this is going to go. So right now it's going in Thor images source, or ThorHammer source images. I'll put it in here, and I'll put Sarcona ThorHammer dot tiff. Okay. Now this isn't my full res one. This is still the 960 by 540, right? So even though I'm not ready to actually hit this render button and make it go, that's fine. I can set up that whole chain, and every time I bring an image in, it's already set up. I just have to go through and pick certain things. Okay, so if I brought in a new image, I would go here and load the new image in, make sure that's reading the correct AO, make sure that's reading the correct Z to focus, and then set my Z to focus, pick a background for it, everything else works. That's it, okay? So then what I would do is just go back into Maya. I would set my settings up crazy high, 32 or 3000, 2400. I only need one camera. That's fine. Just perspective. I would make my settings up high enough that I don't get any fuzzies. If you're not sure about any of these settings and you're going to be gone for like 3 hours, just make them higher, okay? If you're totally not sure about it, just make them higher, because what you don't want to do is it takes 20 minutes and it's too crappy and you've wasted 3 hours. If I know that I'm going to be gone for the night, like sometimes before I go to sleep, I'll render stuff, I'll take these settings and put them up. Now, I don't go crazy high, like 10 I think is probably crazy high, but I would probably go up to like 5 or 6 here. The diffuse, I'd probably put up to 5. Specular, I put up to 5. There's no glass in my scene, so I have no transmissive things, so I would pull that off. I have no subsurface scattering, so there's no skin. I'd pull that off. Volume indirect, I don't have any volume indirect, which was like that light. If I can pull that off. That should be good there. And then I could also crank this up just a little bit. There. Okay. And then I would go to render. I would save first, of course. Then I would go to my render view and just let this thing do its job. Okay? And if it takes, like I said, if it takes all night to do, big deal. It takes all night. It's done in the morning, you know. Even if I have to fix it tomorrow and then let it render the next night and the next night and the next night, it's not a big deal. Keep in mind that you've worked on this for a week, 2 weeks, about, right? This could be something you get a job with, right? Any project we do in this class could be something that somebody looks at and says, that looks amazing, I want to hire you to do that for my place. So you want to make sure that you're putting in the time and the effort to make sure it's as good as you can get it, so that when you put it in your portfolio, it stands out. Okay. Now, as a asterisk on this, if you're doing a Thor hammer and there's 20 Thor hammers in the class, that may not stand out in a demo reel, okay? Especially people looking at it. But if your Thor hammer looks super amazing and you've done stuff to it to customize it and modify it and whatever, or you've taken these concepts and applied it to something else, the same thing, right? So you have to be aware of all that stuff. All right, so I'm going to just let this chug along. When it gets done, I'll just load it into Nuke and then just write it out, and that's it. Okay.